It's a pleasure to be back here with the Center for Security Policy. A lot has happened, actually, in the last month since I was here. As Frank pointed out, there's been a flurry of missile tests and, of course, the May 25th nuclear test. I'd like to start out, though, by actually reporting some good news and something that actually makes me quite happy, which is essentially to say that there is a silver lining to this, albeit radioactive cloud, which is to say that for the first time in 6 years, a U.S. administration official, in this case Secretary Robert Gates, has acknowledged publicly that the six-party talks are not working. If you recall, when I was here a month ago, I said one of the fundamental flaws of the Bush administration was that we continued to constantly put a happy face on each round of the six-party talks. No meeting could possibly fail. Every time we came out, whether it was Jim Kelly or whether it was Chris Hill, they always said we're making progress, we're moving forward on a clear trajectory to accomplish our objective. Last week in Singapore, however, Secretary Gates correctly acknowledged the reality, which is to say that the six-party talks simply are not working. I consider that to be an important first step. Recognizing that the current policy isn't working is at least some progress to be made in terms of at least doing no harm. The second sort of reason I'm happy is that I think it debunks firmly the argument that some on the left have made that it was the hardline policy which was driving North Korea's nuclear program. If you recall, when I spoke here a month ago, I said I started with an initial assumption, which was that nuclear weapons were integral to the survival of Kim Jong-il's regime, and you could not divorce the two. I think, but the argument, of course, during the Bush administration from critics such as John Kerry was that, well, the hardline policy was what prompted North Korea to test and drive its nuclear policy. There's no question that the second term of the Bush administration, though, essentially was a flip-flop from the first, and that we continued to throw more carrots. The February 13th agreement where Kim Jong-il was going to get essentially civil nuclear power and heavy fuel assistance from the United States. So to the extent that that has the argument then that our hardline policy is no longer, or at least we can arguably, I think we can intellectually honestly say that that's not what's driving North Korea's nuclear agenda, I think is a positive step. Because I think it's pretty fair to say that when Obama said that he was going to essentially continue the six-party talks, there was the perception out there then that, that along with the reset button was going to enable Kim Jong-il to feel comfortable coming back to the diplomatic table at the six-party talks. Clearly that has not come to fruition, and I think that's an important step forward. The third reason, or sort of silver lining, if you will, to this radioactive cloud is that, and I want to qualify this or caveat it at the beginning, any long-term solution to the North Korean situation, I think, is going to have to involve China one way or the other. But I think it's fair to say that China, Russia, and South Korea were suitably ticked off, forgive my, sloppy vernacular there, with North Korea's nuclear test. South Korea just announced that they were joining the Proliferation Security Initiative, which I think is a major step forward. Even though they were cooperating with us privately on many of these initiatives, the fact that they have done so publicly, I think, is a step forward. Moreover, I think the fact that China and Russia have signaled that they were prepared to adopt tougher sanctions at the UN, that resolution is still being negotiated now, I think is a positive step forward. Now, let me be clear. I don't think that the UN is going to solve the problem, and I don't think that sanctions are necessarily going to solve the problem. However, to the extent that China and Russia can signal to North Korea that they are displeased with their actions, that does provide at least some greater cover for the United States in terms of pursuing our other activities, such as our own financial sanctions or the Proliferation Security Initiative activities. I thought it was quite interesting for those of you who study China to watch the way their blog system has worked, or even their central news agency has worked, which is to say within the last couple of weeks, or last week or so since the nuclear test, through a number of official outlets, for example, on the People's Daily webpage, the banner headline was, "Beijing condemns North Korea's nuclear test." Now, let's be clear, that's not, let's not read too much into that, but the point being is that within the public discourse, within China, I think there's a greater recognition that North Korea is a liability to China than they had otherwise thought. Now, let me caveat that further, though, by saying, look, China's objective here is stability. Their bottom line is that they do not want a reunified peninsula, particularly with the capital in Seoul. However, they do recognize that instability on the peninsula, fomented by North Korea's activities, is a cause for concern because in addition to the reaction in places like South Korea and notably Japan, it does, of course, give the United States broader leeway to pursue anti-proliferation activities. Some people have suggested that China might join the Proliferation Security Initiative themselves. I think that's unrealistic. They publicly will not do that, but they at least have in the past cooperated to some extent in these activities, and I applaud that. The second part of my comments is going to focus on why now? What is it, or why within the past month has North Korea engaged in this activity? As Frank alluded to in his introductory remarks, it's important to put this in the context of Kim Jong-il's legacy and the recent announcement, albeit through somewhat informal channels, but leaks to the press, et cetera, which is that Kim Jong-il has named his successor, namely son number 3. As a brief aside, you might ask, well, what happened to son number 1 and son number 2? I'll briefly describe what happened. Son number 1 was a bit of a playboy dilettante and got caught in Japan with a fake Dominican passport several years ago. When detained at the airport, he said, I wanted to go to Tokyo Disneyland. I doubt dear leader thought that that was sort of in keeping with the spirit of the Kim Il-sung legacy. So, pardon?
Exactly in keeping with his legacy?
Well, you may be more of a scholar on that than I am, but yeah. Son number 2 was viewed as sort of mentally unstable. There's not much known about him, but the Japanese chef who worked for Kim Jong-il for a long time said that he was weak and too effeminate to effectively rule the country. Read into that what you will. So that leaves son number 3. He's only 26 years old, but Kim Jong-il has apparently chosen him as the successor. They promoted him in several worker party type functions. And the word on the street, at least among several scholars, is that 2012 is the 100-year anniversary of Kim Il-sung's birth, and that they're trying to sort of pave the way for Kim Jong-un is the name of the third son, to sort of formally take over the role. So I think Kim Jong-il, through these missile tests, through the nuclear tests, is trying to promote and preserve his legacy as the person who created the weapon systems to help defend the nation. But I also think that he's doing it in order to sort of pave the way, if you will, for a new era with his son taking over. It's interesting, as a side note, apparently there are already songs being written about the son number 3 and about how wonderful and glorious he is, which is sort of an indication that he probably is, in fact, the chosen successor. The other reason, of course, that I think North Korea has conducted these tests is the one I mentioned a month ago, which is sort of generically applies to their tests, which is it's a great advertising campaign for them. They are well known as a proliferator of WMD and ballistic missile-related technology, and nothing works better than a brochure than an actual successful test. If intelligence reports are to be believed from news outlets, it does appear that North Korea actually will be testing within, perhaps by mid-June, another long-range ballistic missile. Their first 2 tests have been only marginally successful in that regard. Now, what are the implications of this test, both in terms of U.S. foreign policy, but then also sort of general regional stability and perhaps international stability? One concern that I have, I always joke with, I don't know if you guys know Dave Wormser, he's a good friend of mine, but he's primarily a Middle East scholar. And we would always sort of joke back and forth, who's the bigger threat, Iran or North Korea? Just trying to pretend like we were more important, in terms of our own advising to John Bolton. The answer is, of course, both, albeit for different reasons. I think people are correct to say that North Korea's nuclear test doesn't necessarily destabilize the region in a way that Iran's nuclear capability would, for the very simple reason that North Korea is surrounded by pretty powerful neighbors. That's, I don't think, too much in dispute. But it concerns me that the Obama administration has taken sort of a complacent attitude to these tests. Sure, they've condemned them. We're going to have strong strongly worded resolution at the United Nations. And while I understand the argument that you don't want to provoke a crisis, I think there are three primary reasons why this complacent attitude is dangerous. First, of course, is what I've alluded to or mentioned earlier with respect to outward proliferation. I mean, North Korea at this point, to our knowledge, has not exported fissile material, but it's very clear that they were involved in the building of a reactor in Syria. There's no question that North Korea's activities with Iran has dealt with ballistic missile technology, other WMD-related activities. And so I think that their outward proliferation, particularly for a cash-starved regime, is a threat. The second reason why I think this complacent attitude is dangerous is because of the symbol it sends to other would-be proliferators. If we simply have a complacent attitude and are going to de facto, even if not in our official rhetoric, accept North Korea as a nuclear weapon state, I think other states such as Iran, Syria, Saudi Arabia, perhaps others, will learn that lesson as well, and that's not a lesson we want to be sending. The third reason that I think we need to be quite concerned about North Korea, and I'll be clear here, this is a little bit amorphous, but if you look at history, the times of successions in dictatorships are fraught with uncertainty, and uncertainty means unpredictability. I have no greater insight, I think, than anyone in this room into sort of the inner machinations of what goes on in terms of Kim Jong-il, the generals, et cetera. But I think it is fair to say that if you look at successions in dictatorships, they tend to go more, they are more unstable than in democratic systems for obvious and generic reasons. Moreover, dictatorships don't tend to end particularly well. And if in fact it is a crisis of some sort that eventually ends the dynasty of the Kim family, I think that period will be one of considerable danger because you'll have unsecure nuclear weapons. We don't really know a lot about those generals there, et cetera. And we don't really have much precedent to look at history as a guide. The only two regimes that have ever given up nuclear weapons in the past have been Ukraine and South Africa, and I think all of us would agree that North Korea is a different kettle of fish entirely, and their regime change itself would by definition be different. Finally, let me conclude with some implications for U.S. foreign policy. The first, I think, and I only mentioned very briefly the last time I was here, but I'll expand a little bit more on today. I mean, just as I found it bizarre, if not surreal, that President Obama was in the Czech Republic calling for an end to worldwide nuclear weapons, right as North Korea was testing a missile. Similarly now, he's cutting missile defense. He's capping interceptors in Alaska and California right at a time when North Korea is testing missiles and has indicated that they're going to continue to do so. If you look at other countries around the world, India, Japan, they're talking about expanding missile defense. I think that there are there are a number of reasons why the U.S. should be expanding this program, not simply for our own basic self-defense, but also that it helps send a signal to countries like India and Japan that we are on their side and that they'll take our bilateral security alliance seriously. The second thing, which I think is just surreal to me, is that the president intends to push, apparently, for CTBT, which again, I mean, just as North Korea is testing a nuclear weapon, he's out there promoting the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. I by no means am an expert on CTBT, but I don't have it with me, but Paula DeSutter, former Assistant Secretary of State for Verification and Compliance, wrote a very good op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. I would refer to you as a good read on why CTBT should not be ratified. The third implication for U.S. policy, and here I will give some credit to the Obama administration, is that they have talked more about further sanctions, both within the UN and apparently just within the last 48 hours about our own internal or domestic financial sanctions. As you may recall, last time I was here, I spoke about the FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, as moving forward in this regard, and applaud the work of Treasury, which is moving independently from the State Department to push these sanctions, just as they did with the terrorism list. I think that's a great idea. And to the extent that we can cut off the hard currency to North Korea, that will only serve our purposes because that's how they fund their WMD programs. I was very pleased to hear, Ed, that you're talking about amendments to put North Korea back on the state sponsors of terrorism list. Frankly, they never should have been taken off, and it basically shows you what appeasement gets you. Finally, I would point out, everybody keeps talking about China, and I alluded to it at the beginning. China is very important. Obviously, it supplies 80 to 90% of North Korea's energy needs, and we need to have, I think the opportunity is ripe, or being the good Maoist as I am, strike while the iron is hot, as Mao used to say. We have an opportunity now to go to China and say, we let you manage the six-party process. It's not worked. We need a new tact. I don't necessarily know what that means, but at least there is an opportunity there for us to engage. I'm not necessarily optimistic we will do that. Finally, I would just conclude with saying, though, that despite my cautious optimism and the silver lining I spoke to about several positive developments in terms of at least people accepting reality, never underestimate the U.S. State Department. The first time, I recall very clearly in 2002, 2003, when this entire crisis was transpiring, and I won't name the individual, but when he said that North Korea kicked inspectors out of Yongbyon, this was pretty early on in the crisis, he said that was, and I quote, a desperate cry for help. In other words, there is the pervasive sense amongst some people that, have bureaucrat will regulate, have diplomat will talk. And while I'm all for communication, I think there will be a push from the bureaucracy within the State Department to say, now is the time to offer them an even bigger and better deal, and we must all work to resist that. Thank you.